Good morning, everyone. My name's Nick Watt. I work for The Guardian. Thank you very much for coming to this policy exchange discussion on the penultimate budget before the general election. I think we can say it's the second financial statement where George Osborne is going to be able to look at a rather rosier picture of the economy. And I think you could possibly describe this as the "we've won" budget. George Osborne is going around saying, "I've won, the economy is up." Nick Clegg is going around saying, "I've won," because this budget will deliver yet again the front page of their general election manifesto, which is raising the personal tax-free allowance again. It'll go over £10,000. And Ed Balls is saying, "I've won," because he's saying that George Osborne has had to, as he has said and will continue to say, borrow a great deal more than he'd originally planned, because the economy tanked after, Ed Balls would say, he sucked too much demand out of the economy. So here we are. We have a great panel to talk about these events. On my immediate left, we've got Ruth Porter, who was the Director of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs, but we all knew in the journalist world that actually Ruth is a real policy wonk. So here she is at Policy Exchange as Head of Economic and Social Policy. On my far left, but actually that's not really where he sits on the political spectrum, is Jeremy Browne, who's been the Liberal Democrat MP for Taunton since 2005. We journalists were not allowed to have any political opinions, but we were all pretty surprised and dismayed when Nick Clegg thought that Jeremy should return to the backbenches in the last reshuffle. He had been a Foreign Office Minister, he was a Home Office Minister, he was one of the Lib Dems who really knew his way round government, so no doubt we'll see him back in the future. On the far right, where of course he doesn't sit in the political spectrum, is John McFall, Lord McFall. John was chairman of the Treasury Select Committee when the economy went through its crisis in 2008 and really did a huge role in lifting the profile of that committee, which obviously has been carried on under its new chairman, Andrew Tari. And right next to me is Nadhim Zahawi, Conservative MP since 2010 for Stratford-upon-Avon, or if you're an American tourist, I think they call it Stratford-upon-Avon. Nadhim is obviously the cleverest member of this panel because we went to school at the same time, the same school, but obviously it wasn't Eton, and that sadly means that Nadhim will not be writing the manifesto for the Conservative. I'm going to ask each member of the panel to speak for about 7 minutes or so, and then I'll ask a question, then I'll open it up to you, because you'll obviously have much cleverer questions than I can possibly ask. And I'm going to ask Ruth to start, because Policy Exchange produced some very interesting research this morning talking about the importance of lowering national insurance rates for employers. That's what the Chancellor should do next week, and Ruth will tell us all about that. Thank you.
Good morning. As Nick says, we're focusing on one very specific thing around the budget, and that is this, that rather than subsidising low pay, we're arguing that politicians need to prioritise wage growth. This is the focus of a new report that we'll be releasing in the next couple of weeks, and it's what we're arguing should be the priority as spending plans are debated. You'll see behind me lots of different proposals that various organisations have been calling for the Chancellor to consider as budget time nears. We think that our priority, a cut in employers' national insurance, is the right one. Our research focuses on what's happened to wages since 1997. It demonstrates why the Coalition is right to focus on national economic growth, but shows that it's important to also explain how it is that this is good for hard-working taxpayers. It sets out 3 main implications. The first of these is that everyone has a stake in economic growth. The second, that a cut to employers' national insurance is the best way to drive up wages. And the third, that the priority should be increasing pay, not just subsidising low wages. So firstly, everyone has a stake in economic growth. What do we mean by this? This analysis that we've done shows crucially that the link between wages and productivity has remained intact across the UK as a whole over the recession. This has been the case across all regions and in all sectors, the only exceptions being agriculture, forestry and fisheries. One of the unusual and well-documented features of this recession has been that as the economy shrunk and there was therefore less demand for workers, employment has stayed relatively robust. Businesses were able to keep more employers on the books but pay them less as they produce less. In real terms, this has meant a fall in productivity and in wages, with real terms wages going down by about 9%. Because wages went down fairly evenly across income groups over the recession, we can expect that as they begin to return to their 2007 levels, the recovery will result in wage growth across the income distribution. This means that as the economy grows, all income groups have a stake in economic output increasing, as wages will rise across the board. This shows that sustained economic growth is the most important factor in terms of wage growth over the next few years. In all the debate about living standards, this bit of the narrative has been missing. There is one important caveat that I should outline on this, and that's that our analysis shows that since 1997, the slowest increases in pay leading up to the recession were seen at the lower middle part of the income distribution. And in particular, this was for people working full-time that had an income of around £17,000, £18,000. So there is a separate question which we found in our research about structural problems with productivity for that particular group of people who are on lower middle incomes. And that's something which we're going to be addressing in further work that we're doing later on this year. Secondly then, we're suggesting that a cut to employers' national insurance is the best way to drive up wages in the light of this. So because the link between productivity and wages has stayed strong, that gives us an opportunity at a time when productivity has fallen, and we need to take full advantage of this. The government has already acknowledged the impact that making it cheaper to employ people can have. They've done this with their focus on a national insurance exemption for under 21s and with the employment allowance, which is particularly helping will particularly help small businesses. But given the majority of people work in large businesses, we need to extend that principle more broadly. ONS data shows that non-wage costs of employment have risen significantly faster than pay levels since 2001. So, increasing the 2015-16 year employer national insurance threshold from £157 to £192 per week, that's the equivalent of £10,000 per year, is what we're proposing. This would save employers around £250 a year for every person they employ above the threshold, and would mean that employers would no longer pay national insurance for around 900,000 employees. This initiative would reduce government revenues by approximately £5.4 billion in that year. Obviously, this would require a reduction in government spending at the same level, and we're doing further work looking at pointing out where we think that £5.4 billion should come from. The idea behind this is that it would make it cheaper for companies to employ people, reducing unemployment faster and creating more competition for workers. This would drive up wages. It would also force employers to concentrate on increasing productivity amongst their existing workforce, which would also result in wage growth. So thirdly, the priority should be increasing pay, not just subsidising low wages. The emphasis in recent years has been on helping those on low wages to cope by using tax credits under Gordon Browne or pushing up the personal allowance has been the focus for this government, rather than increasing pay in the first place. We're proposing that this strategy changes. For those at the very bottom of the income distribution, though, it is clear that the national minimum wage has been quite effective at the bottom of the income distribution since the late 1990s. And it's perhaps stopped it declining as much as other income groups over the recession. In October 2014, the national minimum wage will go up to £6.50. But because of below inflation rises, it will still be 31 pence off the 2007 value. We're suggesting returning it in value to 2007 levels over the next few years, which was its pre-recession purchasing power. But that over the longer term, as median incomes start rising again more quickly than inflation, the Low Pay Commission should look at returning it to its pre-recession level, which was around 55% of median hourly pay. Overall then, the most important point from this research that we've done is that if, as everyone keeps saying, this is the living standards election, then the competition is still over which party can get most economic growth, as that is the key to driving up wages.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I'm now going to call on Nadhim. Nadhim may not be one of the 5 Etonians writing the manifesto, but he is on the number 10 policy board, so he knows what he's talking about.
I don't know about that, Nick. And I've got to be careful what I say, because I tend to get a splash every time I attend one of these great events, whether at Policy Exchange or elsewhere. I think it's useful first to set a little bit of context for next week's budget. With the economy recovering, it's easy to forget where we've come from, and as a result, the fiscal challenges still facing the Chancellor. In May 2010, we inherited the biggest budget deficit in the developed world. The economic picture was pretty grim. £120 million a day in interest payments alone, and over £150 billion a year being borrowed. If we were still borrowing at that same rate that we were in 2010, then by the time I finished my opening remarks, we'd have borrowed £1.4 million. It was against this backdrop that we had an emergency budget laying out initial plans for fiscal consolidation, plans that were unfortunately derailed by the Eurozone crisis. Now, back in 2010, no major forecaster predicted a crisis in the Eurozone as great as it was, dragging down the global growth. But that was where we found ourselves. We all know the result. With our largest export market in a state of flux, the economy took longer to grow than we would have liked. But now, I think we're back on track. With growth at 0.7% last quarter, we'll find out next week what the OBR expect growth to be moving forward. But given that nearly every forecaster has been upgrading expectations in recent weeks, something tells me we can expect the same. And while some of my gloomier colleagues, and of course my colleagues across the floor, will claim that this isn't a balanced recovery, I'm afraid I've got to disagree with them. Just yesterday, the ONS announced that production was up by 2.9% and manufacturing was up again by 3.3%. We're making things again and selling them to the world. In my own region, in the West Midlands, there's been a huge resurgence in car manufacturing. In fact, the resurgence has been across the country, and today a car rolls off a British production line every 20 seconds. And it's not just manufacturing. Services are up, and even the previously slow-moving construction sector is showing signs of robust growth. Then there are the employment figures, with every new release seemingly showing more people than ever before in work. So sentiment is most definitely up. But in this lies a great danger, because there's still a lot of fiscal consolidation to go. And we really shouldn't forget that the task of repairing the public finances is far from complete. But with the economy recovering, there will be those calling for giveaways, and the more the economy grows, the louder those calls will become. And herein lies a communication challenge for the Chancellor. How does he give the good news whilst at the same time saying that it doesn't mean we've got more money to spend? Now, the Chancellor is a master of politics, and the politics of this are important. Why? Because if the public believe the economy is fixed, then come next year, they might hand the keys back to those people who crashed the car in the first place, who will, of course, crash the car again. So next week, I think we can expect to hear something about this, about how the economy is recovering, but that doesn't mean we can return to the bad old days of spend, spend, spend. I suspect, in fact, that may be part of the overarching message readying us for 2015. That doesn't mean there won't be the odd tweak here and there, though. After all, as we've heard from Ruth, tackling the cost of living and making sure people feel that they have more in their pocket at the end of the month is vital in sustaining the consumer-led elements of this recovery. So we can probably expect to see something there. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister have already indicated that if there is any spare money in the kitty, then helping those on the lowest incomes is where it will be focused. So I warmly welcome the Low Pay Commission's recommended rise in the minimum wage, and I hope we continue to strengthen it as the economy recovers. Then there's national insurance, or as my colleague Ben Gummer would prefer it to be called, the earnings tax. Whilst we've looked at the employer's side of this already, cancelling planned rises when we came into office, which really were a jobs tax, and offering the employment allowance from 1st of April. I do think there's more to be done on the employee side. We've made a big play of saying you'll pay no tax on the first £10,000 of earnings, but at the moment you still pay 12% NI on everything between £7,748 and £10,000. That definitely won't be possible right away, but I'd like to see it as an aspiration. And after years of consensus on raising personal allowance, it's a welcome development that Conservatives have now begun to seriously debate where next for income tax. Labour have the 50p, the Lib Dems have their mansion tax. We need our own iconic tax policy. And I think Dave Skelton's contribution and his suggestion that we abolish the 40p rate and pay for it by lowering the 45p threshold was a great way of starting the conversation. Finally, I think we'll see some more help for exporters, something the Chancellor hinted at in his recent speech in Hong Kong. If we can get 1 in 4 to export instead of 1 in 5, that is a game changer for the economy and, of course, for productivity. So those are my thoughts, and I look forward to our discussions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Now call on Jeremy, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Nick, for those kind and flattering opening remarks. I thought I would divide my broad themes, observations, into 5 and spend about a minute on each one. So the first one is the deficit, what Nadhim was just talking about. When this government came to office, we were borrowing, as a country, about £420 million a day, every single day. We're now borrowing in the region of £250, £260 million a day. So progress has been made, but we still are borrowing a colossal amount of money. And the big backdrop to this budget is our dire position and the need to continue down the path of rectifying it. I have reasonable confidence that the government will stick to the task, although I was slightly unnerved by the 2 party conferences of the 2 governing parties in the autumn, when there was this brief Dutch auction where the Conservatives promised to spend extra money on a marriage tax break and the Liberal Democrats promised to spend extra money on giving free school meals to all infant school-aged children. The message I felt that sent is that there is money to splash around, and I think it's a difficult message to send when at the same time you've told the electorate that the educational maintenance allowance or child benefit for taxpayers above a certain threshold is unaffordable. And I think the government needs to make sure that it explains the necessity of deficit reduction with absolute clarity. My second is tax. The headline delivery point will be the arrival of the £10,000 exemption from next month, already been announced, but will only take effect from next month. I wonder then where the government will go, because the Liberal Democrats are very keen to make sure that everybody understands that this is a policy stamped with a Lib Dem ownership mark, but the Conservatives are keen to usurp the ownership of that as well. And there is, as a result, I suppose, a tendency within government and between the 2 governing parties to keep knocking it up another 500 every budget just to try and stay ahead of the race. But it's expensive. Quite modest increases cost a large amount of money, and maybe the government would be best placed to make sure that people realise how much money has already been given away through this policy, rather than working on the assumption that we need to keep giving away large amounts before people will start to notice. The third area is maintaining a flexible and business-friendly environment. And I think on this area the government has set the right tone, and as was just said, George Osborne's recent speech in Hong Kong contributed to that, us having lower corporation taxes than other G7 countries, reductions in national insurance contribution payments relating to the employment of young people. Big fact within our continent at the moment is that people are voting with their feet. The reason that Theresa May is nowhere near meeting her immigration reduction targets is because people in southern Europe have seen what happens when left-wing governments try and manage their economies by making their labour markets extremely inflexible, and they're coming to work in everything from pret-a-manger to higher skilled jobs here. So you have 55% youth unemployment in Spain, whereas here youth unemployment as other unemployment is falling. And I think the government has that narrative right, and I hope it continues to explain the necessity of staying on that path. Fourth area is to make sure that we are an open, outward-looking country that embraces globalisation rather than hiding from it. This will be a backdrop to a lot of the debate for the European elections. So I think it's important that Britain is unambiguous about our ongoing membership of the European single market, that we attract inward investments, that we think more imaginatively about how we can communicate with parts of the world which are not normally on our radar, and that we understand that immigration, although it has to be regulated as it is in all countries, is part of being a globalised economy. And if we aspire to being a global hub and we want to maintain our capital city as the preeminent capital city in the world, which I think one can argue it currently is, then we can't disconnect ourselves from the rest of the world. I think that is a big argument going on in British politics. I think the Conservative Party are ambiguous about it because they are torn between some of their instincts, their hearts and their heads in some ways. And I think there are opportunities for genuine, authentic, free market liberals to make the case for Britain having an outward-looking, enlightened, both economic and foreign policy. And my final area is to avoid the sort of micro-meddling paternalism, which irritates me more than almost anything else in budgets. Gordon Browne was a great believer that he could stand at the dispatch box and with a lot of tiny little tweaks could make sure that we all behaved in a way that he would approve of and which would make us better citizens and make this a happy country. And I fear that all the parties get dragged into this. What is respectably called a cost of living election, but is really a micro tweaking of your lives election. The idea that the big issue facing Britain at the start of the Asian century is whether your gas bill goes down by 50p a quarter is just laughable. And yet this is the sort of micro defeatist politics that we have, where we talk about living wages rather than talking about how we can make our economy competitive and make sure that young people have a high enough aptitude at maths to be able to compete in a global marketplace, rather than trying to artificially decree that we will just make everybody wealthy by announcing it in the House of Commons. Well, whether it's fat taxes or sugar taxes or any other ways that politicians show that they are relevant by concentrating on the details while losing sight of the big picture. So I hope the government will have a budget overall which understands that we have a huge deficit, that understands we need competitive taxes, that is supportive of flexible markets, that is open and outward looking, and avoids the temptation to go for those sort of small picture everyday headlines that I think in the long term will make very little difference.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I'm now going to call on Lord McFall, who I'm sure we'll all agree it looks like far too steady a chap to crash a car.
Yeah, driving licence for 50 years, unblemished. Okay, Nick, on that. Could I first of all give apologies for Pat McFadden, Pat's predecessor, Dennis Turner, who was in the House of Commons for 23 years and is in the House of Lords, sadly died of cancer, and it's the funeral today. So Pat gives his apologies on that. So I'm a stand-in from the House of Lords, the unelected House of Lords. So take that with a pinch. Now, forget about economics in this budget and think politics. And actually, I wouldn't like to be Jeremy going round the doors saying, knock, knock, this is Jeremy Browne here, I want you to re-elect me. But it's pretty laughable about your gas prices going down 50 pence, forget it. I think that there is a resonance in the country on that issue of living standards. I also think the issue of GDP growth, whilst it's important in Westminster, I think in the rest of the country it is largely meaningless, because living standards in 2018 will be 3.5% below the levels which they were in 2007, and the latest OBR figures show that earnings will not return to their 29-10 levels until 2018-19, and I think that that will have a resonance in the country. I think that political parties in the next year have to give some hope to the electorate, and I think that will be the key, along with their message that they can organise the economy responsibly. I think there'll be three issues: taxation, housing and business. Now, George Osborne said he would eliminate the deficit by 2015 and that he would reduce the deficit with spending cuts. Well, given the FT's analysis last week about the £20 billion hole in public finances, I think that, along with eliminate the deficit, is going up in smoke. But austerity will rule, but I give my experience as a former chairman of the Treasury Committee, and that goes back since 2001. Governments always produce rabbits out of the hat. So whilst there's no more money to spend, you will get initiatives in the next week where the government will indeed be spending money. Take the issue, was it just last year, of school meals and the marriage tax allowance. That was done up just at the drop of a hat between Nick Clegg and David Cameron. But if you look at the Times this morning, on it you have Michael Gove's ex-advisor, Dominic Cummins, saying that he's wanting people to lodge freedom of information requests, the DFE, to prove his claims that the free meals issue is a gimmick based on fictional cost projections. And David Laws has dismissed that criticism as, and forgive me, utter balls. So that's the level of debate in government at this time. So government isn't functioning at all, really. And it's different parties, as you heard this morning with Jeremy, you know, the Liberal Democrats taking credit for what has happened. So that's what the next year's about, and that's what the election is about. The issue of personal taxation, will that go up? Fine. If it goes up to 10,750, as people are suggesting, is it a good thing? Well, actually, 2.5 million people have been taken out of tax already by the increasing the thresholds. So if the aim of the policy is to boost income to lowest earning individuals, then the limits of that policy have already been reached for a growing number of people. So you'll see a Peter and Paul approach. And we saw a Peter and Paul approach in the past with Labour governments as well. That's what I saw, as I said, from a vantage position as chairman of the committee. For example, take the budget 2013. The bottom 10% of households were worse off because of the changes to the benefit system alongside the tax changes for the thresholds which the government had introduced. So there is always a Peter-Paul element there. Now, the issue is tackling the squeezed middle in the aspirational middle class, and I see from the papers this morning that the backbench Conservative MPs are very concerned about the issue of fiscal drag. 1 million people have been taken into the 40% tax threshold by the announcement last year that the threshold would be taken to £41,450 in 2013-14. So that's since 2010. And the Times has the issue this morning, I think it was the IEA, that mentioned that in 1990, 1 in 5 were in the top 40% tax threshold. In 2010, that was 1 in 10. And 4 years later, it will be 1 in 6. So I think that that is a big issue. And in a sense, it's taxation by stealth. People don't realise what that is. So that's one issue. Second issue, housing. Basic rule there, we cannot solve the housing crisis without an increase in supply. And we have not seen it. And the issue of affordable housing and the lack of social housing is a serious policy issue. David Davis and I wrote an article last week or so for the House magazine lauding Prudential for the initiative which they undertook by building 1,000 social housing homes in Wales as a long-term infrastructure project. And we've still not got the infrastructure project arrangements right. That's a small example, but it's a good and a welcome example. And I would like to see aspects like that in the budget. The Help to Buy or the Help to Vote scheme, that definitely needs to be withdrawn because we don't need to see a further increased surge in house prices. And I would suggest that this money should be diverted to help those in modest incomes and to increase the subsidies to others. At the moment, we're subsidising mortgages at the wrong time. And Help to Buy money doesn't count as spending. And that takes me on to an issue which I've been involved in for the past year, and the nerds in here will be very happy to look. I chaired a Fabian Commission 2013 vision, along with a number of people who were in government. And our conclusion, supplementing my view when I was chairman of the Treasury Committee, is that the structures surrounding public spending encourage a short-termism which is out of step with the needs of the country. And we need to ensure we get balanced long-term choices. So I would like to see spending reviews announcement needs include coordinated, detailed plans and department spending and capital investment, and also set out broad direction for social security, tax and non-fiscal policy with major implications for tax and spend. And subsequent budgets could then be used for setting out plans for detailed implementation, especially regarding social security and taxation. At the moment, we've got the rabbit's hat, things come out, it is a good announcement, but there is such a lack of clarity about it that people don't understand. And there are not many MPs in the House of Commons, maybe a handful, who understand the finances in the House of Commons. There are 10 to 12 separate announcements during the year about government spending plans. So there's such a confusion about them that there's a real-time element when an announcement is made, but we don't know what the implications are, and we don't know what the quality of that spending is. So one of the recommendations in this 2030 vision was for an Office of Public Performance as a powerful cross-government body championing excellence, driving productivity improvement and encouraging innovation. Spending decisions are not just about allocating resources, but what we have to achieve with that particular money. And I would like to see, when every spending announcement is made, a year 10 cost of all decisions. So when the spending announcement is made, it's not just the amount of money going, what's the money for, and what's the outcome going to be. Otherwise, we have a disjointed approach between budgets. They are atomised, they're individualised, and we don't have a coherent understanding of public spending. We also need a serious national debate about house building schemes. Harmer Nichols, does anybody know who Harmer Nichols was? He was a Tory MP for Peterborough. And in 1950 he made a speech suggesting that the Tory government build 300,000 houses a year. And Harold Macmillan took him up on that, and indeed built 300,000 houses a year in the 1950s austerity Britain. So I'm looking for equivalent Harmer Nichols here so that we can get 300,000 houses or a target for house building. If we can do it in the 50s, surely we can do it now. And the big elephant in the room is lending to business, the banking system needing a spare tyre. As we stand today in 2014, there is less competition in banking and less innovation in it. We need to look as to how we have equity financing in our country, how we get the capital markets working as they do in the United States, and how we create that spare tyre in banking. We've still got the issue of too big to fail. If you look at the interview that Alan Greenspan has given, former Fed chairman, he said, the situation now is that I don't understand what's happening in the synthetic derivatives market. There is more debt, and with the establishment of what they call SIFIs, significantly influential financial institutions, 24 of them, it means that too big to fail is still here for a long time. So the big issue for all politicians is how do we create our own Mittelstand type in the United Kingdom? How do we support small business? How do we rebalance the economy? How do we renew manufacturing? And how do we ensure investment infrastructure for the long term? I mentioned David Davis. David and I have set up a forum, think tank in the House of Commons, New City Agenda, looking at long-term approach so that we can sustainable public policies for the economy and society. As we stand today, the political class don't have that, and that's the big item on the agenda.
Thank you very much, John. I'm now going to ask one little question to each member of the panel, and then I'll open it up to the floor. And I'm going to start with you, Nadhim. In his morning email this morning, Ben Brogan says the issue of the budget is this challenge of the fiscal drag and increasing numbers of people, as the Times says, 1.1 million extra people being taken into the 40% tax bracket. You praised David Skelton, formerly of this parish, who wrote a piece last week talking about how something should be done about that. But it's not going to happen this budget, isn't it? And isn't it a bit late to be doing it? This is really the last budget where a Chancellor can really have an impact on the general election.
Well, I think it's a healthy debate for us to have, as I said in my opening remarks. Although I think it is right that we stick to what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have already said, which is to say that if there is any money in the kitty, it should go towards those on the low end of the pay spectrum. It's an important debate, and Dave has made a contribution to it. I think the difficulty with it sometimes, and you know, Stratford-on-Avon, my constituency, you know, I have a significant minority of people who are affected by, you know, £42,000 and they hit the higher rate. But actually, you know, if you look at the numbers, it's about 15% of the workforce who pay the higher rates of tax. So, you know, we've got to make sure we put it in perspective. You know, let's not have a knee-jerk sort of panic reaction to it, and let's continue to focus. And you know, I think one of the panelists said earlier, I think it was Jeremy, to be fair, let's be consistent, because it's that sort of authenticity in politics which I think delivers victories for you.
Thank you. And Ruth, can I just ask you, how concerned are you that the debate seems to be the Liberal Democrats, it's all about raising the personal allowance. A considerable body in the Conservative Party want to deal with this 40%, and not so much talk about national insurance, which is obviously your big thing with not only the benefits it brings to workers, but the benefit it brings to business.
Well, I think a key aim of any government should be to try and allow hard-working families to keep more of their income in the first place through cutting taxes. But in terms of the context that we find ourselves in at the moment, we've got to be realistic about the fact that the more that we tax employers, the less money they have to pay people in the first place. And if we actually want to help people on low wages and we want to increase productivity and drive wages up in the first place, we need to look at how we make it cheaper for employers to take on new workers.
Right. And Jeremy, you were sort of putting question marks over the various announcements that the two governing parties have made, and also a bit of a question mark about the continuing way in which Nick Clegg wants to take the personal allowance. It'll go up to at least 10,500 in this budget. He then wants to get it up to 12,000, maybe 12,500 in the manifesto. Are you saying, look, 12,500 and no more, or are you saying actually what will be announced in this budget is quite enough on that?
Briefly on the first point, I'm just nervous that we still have a big deficit by any historical standards. Just because it's less colossal than it was before doesn't mean it's still big. And I think there's a tendency of politicians in all parties to start, you know, getting ready to do the giveaways before there's anything much to give away. And I felt the last party conference was a sort of slightly unnerving initial indicator of a sort of mindset which seemed to be informing politics, that we'd got to the stage where we had to decide how to spend all our spare money when there isn't any spare money. And that's, of course, the big fact of life for 40p tax rate thresholds and everything else. In terms of the 10,000 threshold, I mean, look, I think it is very important to incentivise people on lower middle incomes to work. I think it's important for them in terms of having greater spending power, but I think it's also important in terms of their self-sufficiency and independence from the state, that we don't just take money from them and then recycle it back to them, and we allow them to keep more money in the first place. But as John said, it does have diminishing returns, and it costs a lot of money, as I said as well. So we can go further down this path, but it may have diminishing returns both in terms of its impact on people on low middle incomes and in terms of its political impact on the electorate.
Thank you. And John, finally, can I just ask you, obviously you weren't very amused when Nadine suggested that there had been a car crash in 2008, but if there wasn't a car crash, there was certainly a road traffic incident. And obviously you can have a debate about who was to blame. But what do you say to critics who say that the reason why Ed Miliband and Ed Balls, who may be ahead in the polls, the reason why they're struggling to gain traction on the economy is they haven't really faced up to and acknowledged that road traffic incident?
Yeah. Okay, but in terms of the road traffic incident, when we went into the recession in 2007, average public spending was about 37%. If you look at the years 1997 to 2010, it worked out about 39.5%. If you look at the years 1979 to 1997, average public spending was 43.5%. So let's get it in perspective in terms of government. All governments have been the same in terms of public spending. Indeed, in the Conservative years, it was bigger. There needs to be further to go with the Labour Party in terms of establishing its economic credibility with people. I think they've made a decent stab of it, but every time that Labour comes out with its policy, then the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats get a hold of it and implement it. So the key is for any opposition, and we saw that with Tony Blair and Gordon Browne in announcements, is give a sense of direction where you're going, but don't have precise policies, because we don't want the Dean and company taking credit for what is not the original thinking.
So luckily we didn't implement Ed Balls' plan B, right?
No, you implemented Alistair Darling's plan A.
You're in government, mate. You're in government. See what I mean? Look at this.
The question to you is, why do you think the public in the ICM poll in The Guardian today showed that the public still blaming the Labour government for the crash?
Because you were masters of the spin, right? And no, really.
So we're to blame, right?
No, but what happened to the Labour Party when it went down? Gordon Browne vacated, and there was a 6-month interregnum there, and it was George Osborne saying it was the UK which exercised this folly, whereas it was a global financial crisis. That is the issue. And all the talk here about the economy and prospering economy has as a backdrop the issue of the global economy. Whether Europe's getting out of its high debt, what's happening to developing markets, that's the issue here. It's not just that. So I give you, as a former founder of YouGov, your spin was fabulous.
Right. Is that why David Miliband had to vacate his seat? Because he was the only one actually saying we ought to
Very good. Well, look, before this little love-in intensifies even further, I'm going to open this up to the floor. Now, I think Harriet's team have microphones, so there's a guy right at the back there.
So the carbon price freeze, do you think it will restore investor confidence in the competitiveness of British foundation industries? And if not, and going to Jeremy's point about tinkering, what would a serious reform of British energy policy actually look like in the budget?
Thank you very much. Because time is running out, I might sort of group the questions. So there is a chap just in the front here.
Jeremy Thomas, Interested Spectator. If I may go back to Ruth's original proposal for increase of the national insurance threshold, she makes the very valid point that low productivity and low wages go together. But could the same not also be said of low levels of skill, for which the British economy is marked, but not very well? Would it be possible to frame this proposal in a way that employers would qualify for it if they were to make some contribution to upskill their existing labour force or to provide good, rigorous apprenticeships in order to achieve that same end, and thus bring our levels of skill closer to that of other competitive economies in Northern Europe, which tend to have surpluses where we have deficits? And one very brief point to Lord McFall. He mentioned the 300,000 target for housing. It was, in fact, I believe, housing units, and a great proportion of it was in flats, which helped it be achieved more quickly.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I'll go to Ruth first, because Jeremy mentioned you. Talk about the skills challenge, and if you want to talk about carbon prices, do feel free, but not if you don't want to.
I mean, part of the thinking with our proposal is that what it will do is it will act as an incentive for employers to actually focus on how they do get more productivity out of their existing workforce, and skills will obviously factor as a major part of that. So I think if you can boost employment, you will encourage employers to focus on skills and you'll drive up productivity that way. I mean, one interesting thing as well, at the moment in some of the surveys that we're starting to see, for example, the recent REC KPMG one, they showed that there's some evidence that skills shortages are already beginning to drive up wages. And so as we see that, there is an incentive there for employers to focus on what they do about the skills of their existing workforce.
Thank you. John, if you wanted to answer Jeremy's question on housing, and if you wanted to say anything about skills.
Well, on the issue of housing, fine, and units, and what we need to do is reflect on the population that we have, the demographics, what type of houses are best for people now. I mean, I know in the area I come from, there's hardly any bungalows, for resident people. There's a limited supply of flats. So yeah, what's appropriate for particular areas? And, I'm with you on that issue. On the issue of skills, a number of years ago, with the Treasury Committee, we did a report on globalisation. We visited India and China. And I remember saying to my colleagues, Michael Fallon and others, look, this is a very worthy inquiry we've got, but we're not going to get any publicity for it at all, because people aren't particularly interested. But the backdrop of globalisation is that there's an abundance of skills in India, in China and elsewhere. So how do we equip people in this country to ensure that we can complement the work that's going on in India, China, and not rival it? Because given we've got a 60 million population and we've got populations of over 1 billion in both, it ain't going to happen. So how do we equip people? And the big elephant in the room there is the issue of artificial intelligence and data. We've seen it with Google. They're talking about Google with 80% of skilled work, accountants and others, being redundant maybe in 20 or 25 years' time. And just how advanced artificial intelligence has been. I was at a lecture a few months ago where I was informed that the New York Times had an interview with a robot which has the intelligence of a 7-year-old. So if that's happening in 2014, Nick, what's going to happen in another 20 years' time? And none of us in the political sphere have taken that on. Big issue.
Thank you, Nadhim. You're a member of the Downing Street Policy Unit. You are the man to tell us all about carbon prices.
You're very fond of reminding me of the fact that I'm on the Downing Street Policy Unit, which is a good thing to do, just in case I speak out of turn. But the AI intelligence is embedded in the head at the moment you join the unit. On carbon, I think, two things to say. One, we need to begin to see carbon capture and storage technology actually scaling up. Until we begin to see us being able to deliver. There's been some great initiatives, but they're still in prototype. This isn't yet a proven technology, and I would caution us to be very careful that all we do is displace manufacturing jobs in the UK to Poland or elsewhere in the world. And the other thing to say on it is you look at what's happened in America. I attended a presentation by Megan O'Sullivan, who's now at Harvard, who's a specialist on energy. And the shale gas and oil revolution in America is extraordinary. You've had the average American family have a reduction of $1,000 in their energy bills. And this is where I'm going to disagree with Jeremy. These things are important to people, and I think it matters if their energy bill can be brought down by government policy. But you've also seen American carbon footprint lowered because they've been able to move away from dirty coal to clean gas. And I think those are the sort of things we need to be looking at, where we take a pragmatic approach and have a joined up strategy for the energy sector. And I think that's beginning to happen. On the question on housing, I think the reforms are already beginning to bear fruit, but you're absolutely right. I think we need to be ambitious about our targets for more house building. I can tell you in my own constituency, young people like my researcher at the back can't afford to stay and live in the constituency and buy a home there because there's a decoupling between average wage and average house price in Stratford-on-Avon. And therefore, very much in favour of making sure that local plans are developed, are in place, but targets are pushed hard on planning authorities to make sure that they actually deliver on those.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Jeremy to hold your thoughts because we're running out of time. Any more questions? Laura Patel from The Times.
Hi, this is a question for John. You said that you think that Labour still has some way to go before it establishes full economic credibility. Do you think that's a question? Can you set out some of the weak points? Is that a question of people or policies or both?
I'm going to take one more question because we're running out of time. The woman back there.
I think it's
Hold on, John. We're just going to take one more. We're going to group them.
Laura van der Hoeven from Citizens Advice. There's been a lot of discussion about the personal tax threshold, and I just wondered if anybody in the panel had any insights into if we might get any more insights in the budget into where the extra 20 billion in welfare cuts might come. And John's already sort of alluded to the Peter and Paul that goes on between tax cuts and welfare cuts, and sort of one paying for the other, and particularly whether or not we might get any more detail on funding for free school meals and childcare costs under universal credit, which will be the biggest barrier to making work pay for people who claim that benefit.
Thank you very much. John, if you'd like to answer Laura Patel's question about Labour and then Citizens Advice.
If I could just say, in terms of shale gas and fracking, I'm a member of the Economic Affairs Committee of the House of Lords, and we're presently going to come out with a report on that. But without getting into great detail on that, there's big issues with that yet in the UK. First of all, the regulatory dispersion. There's so many regulators involved in it that are we going to get a proper approach to it? Secondly, the issue of communities. If fracking takes place, as you've seen previously, then you've got to allay community fears and community interest, and that hasn't been done already. There's been a suggestion that you give communities £100,000, but that's all insufficient. Government needs to do that. And the third thing is, in government, there has to be a champion on this. There has to be leadership, and not one particular department is taking that. So that's the background to fracking. Yeah, it could be beneficial. There's only been 2 or 3 wells been explored to date, so it's very slow. And therefore there needs to be leadership on that. On the wider issue, I could say to you, in terms, and I've got the vantage point of looking at it, if you like, from the House of Lords, where in the House of Lords, you do not give your opinion, you're asked for your opinion, okay? So on that. But I think that the background to this issue is that the social contract in this country is broken down. And what was the social contract? It was that GDP increased, everybody got a share of it, people were more prosperous. Some get a bigger share, some get a small share. Now, a lot of people aren't getting any share, and I think that the public are sceptical of all political classes in sense of being effective on it, and they see the political classes as being uniform, and that's a task for Labour, but it's also a task for Tories and the Lib Dems.
Jeremy, if you'd like to answer, was it Laura from Citizens Advice? It was Laura, yeah. Concerns about the 20 billions of...
Can I do the previous round or not?
Yeah, on carbon, yeah, Greenest Party.
Well, I'll be really brief because you're up. I mean, my point on energy, and I was criticised by both Nadhim and John, is that prices are a function of supply and demand, a calibration of risk and reward. I'm sorry to sort of bring a few capitalist truths to bear, but that is the reality, and the politicians can tinker on the margins and they can bribe you with a bit of your money by subsidising some of your bills. And if you think that the challenges we face as a country can be boiled down to that, then I think you'll find a rude shock when the force of globalisation, which influence ultimately energy prices to a much greater degree than individual governments can, overwhelm the pretences of the politicians. And in terms of skills, look, we have an issue as a country. We've just had these PISA league tables out again. They show that in the 3 categories for 15-year-olds, Britain isn't in the top 20 for any of the 3 categories. So we have this pretense that we will do well because we will be a knowledge economy, despite the fact that, particularly in Asia, the competition is more knowledgeable than us. And that gives us problems, not at our elite top 20% level, because we are globally competitive in our top 5th in educational terms. But in the middle, we are not good enough, and we have endemic educational underachievement in lower socioeconomic groups. So those were the sort of macro points I was making, which is why I think it's important that we embrace globalization, and where we are challenged by the consequence of globalization, rather than trying to artificially manipulate our way out of those corners, we think fundamentally about how we make ourselves globally competitive.
And Laura's question on the welfare cuts?
Well, I think there is too much entrenched welfarism. So despite becoming a father for the first... There's nothing more boring than a middle-aged man who's become a father for the first time. But that is what I have done. And I don't get any child benefit because MPs earn too much money to be eligible for child benefit. But I think that's a good change, even though I'm a loser as a result of it, because I think there is too much inbuilt welfareism, including in parts of the income groups and including retired people where it's unaffordable.
And let me ask Ruth and Nadhim to answer that question on those welfare cuts. George Osborne is saying that there's going to have to be an extra 25 billion of cuts between 16-17, 17-18, of which 12 billion, he says, need to come from welfare. And then Chris Giles from the FT helpfully pointed out that it would be another £20 billion black hole. So Ruth, first of all, if you could answer that question from Laura from Citizens Advice.
We're doing a piece of work at the moment going through looking at where we think those reductions in welfare should come from. And I think, in a sense, there's two different questions with welfare. Some is kind of longer-term system reform, and how do you actually reform the welfare system over the longer term, looking at things like introducing more of a contributory principle, which in the short term, obviously, there's not going to be any announcements on. The other aspect are, how do you, within the framework of the current system, look at saving money in a few different places? And clearly in the short term, that's going to be the focus. But I think both of those are important questions.
Any finally?
Well, it's worth just standing back a little bit and thinking about, what is it we're trying to do in welfare? I.e., this isn't just about making the numbers add up. It's about human beings. And actually, you look at what everything Ian Duncan Smith has done to date. It's all about, getting people out of that welfare trap. And we had a couple of weeks ago the debate about the sort of moral outrage. I think the real moral outrage is people being trapped on welfare, because when they do the calculation between housing benefit and JSA, there's no point going out to try and work. So the reform that we're trying to deliver on is one about people rather than about numbers. Of course, your question is a good one to say, well, where is the saving going to come from? I can't sit here and tell you, what Ian and George are talking about, but from what I see, that there is a discussion about under 25s and housing benefit, and around that you need to also put a safety net around those who simply can't stay with an abusive parent or have particular issues that force them out of a home. But these are important questions. These are difficult questions to answer, and I think they're important that we have a national debate as to how these reforms are introduced and where do you try and find the savings at the end of the day.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks also to John, thanks to Jeremy, thanks to Ruth, thanks to Policy Exchange, and thanks to Harriet Mackenzie for doing such a professional job.